Hey, I'm Kevin, and this is HFX by Bike, a channel all about getting around Halifax by bike. The painted lanes on Windsor Street are part of an important north-south corridor on the Halifax Peninsula for bikes, and aside from maybe the Halifax Commons, are arguably the part of the bike network most connected to the rest of the city. In today's video, I'm going to go over some of the problems that came up when I made my spotlight tour, and mock up some improvements to make the entire corridor a bit safer and more convenient to ride along. The Windsor lanes are just paint, and that comes with the issue of them being ignored by other road users. Drivers routinely try to squeeze past turning vehicles via the bike lane, and parked cars are a frequent issue. But it's not just cars. Every time a bus on Windsor pulls over to pick up or drop off passengers, it fully occupies the bike lane while leaving enough space for cars to pass. Like most roads, Windsor slopes downward at the periphery to avoid buildup of water and debris. Unfortunately, this means that the painted lanes sit in what is essentially a gutter. They're prone to filling with water, leaves, and especially uncleared snow during the winter months, severely limiting their usefulness. The most straightforward fix for all of these issues is to make the lanes protected. Going straight to elevated lanes solves all of these problems at once, so I've just rendered them that way from the get-go. I've gone over it in other videos, but there are ways to design transit stops so that they maintain their priority without inconveniencing cyclists. This takes the form of creating a limited access island between the road and the bike lane. Essentially, the bike lane passes behind the transit stop, thereby removing the conflict point entirely. That's the basic design, but anyone who's used the Windsor Street painted bike lanes knows that many of the problems are site-specific. Going from north to south, one thing you notice about the bike lanes on Windsor Street is that they just sort of stop for no apparent reason. In the outbound direction, they cut out just before Hood Street. Inbound, they pick up past Ashton Lane. This doesn't seem to be an issue with road width or anything else, so I'm just going to extend them to the intersection with Closeout. You might be wondering why I'm stopping here, and that's because this is what's known as a cop-out. The road design changes, and once you go past Closeout, you have to start redesigning the Windsor Street Exchange, one of the most important transportation choke points in the entire city. I'm totally on board, but that would easily be its own video. So if you want to see a dead zone video where I redesign the Windsor Street Exchange, you'll have to leave a comment below. Back to Windsor Street and moving south, there's not much to comment on until we reach the intersection between Windsor-Young-Bayers. In the inbound direction, the bike lane cuts out to make space for a left turn lane for cars. The intersection is also covered by slip lanes that cut across the bike lane. The transition between Bayers and Yonge Street creates a misaligned intersection, which widens out the entire space and creates awkward turn angles for some of the traffic lanes, as well as making the entire area a bit of a pain to cross as a pedestrian. To make things even more complicated, there's also an outbound transit lane. A 2022 traffic study shows that this intersection only sees about 2,000 vehicles per hour in the busiest hour of the day, and most of the movements don't actually conflict with one another, so it's probably not necessary to use all of this space to move that number of vehicles. I want to save some space to better fit in the bike lanes and make pedestrian crossings easier, so I'm going to replace the signalized intersection with a roundabout, but not just any roundabout. This is called a dog bone or peanut roundabout. I've laid this one out as a simple, single-lane system for motor vehicle traffic moving through the intersection. This one is modeled on a real-world example in Big Bear Lake, California, which I've linked the street view of in the description so that you can go explore it yourself. The dimensions should be wide enough to allow emergency vehicles in transit to move through the intersection without any issue, but there's still plenty of space left over in case I've botched the geometry. I kept the transit lane in place and have more or less had it just ignore the roundabout by going around it entirely. In other words, it retains priority over motor vehicle traffic while moving through the intersection. The bike lanes now extend all the way through the intersection, essentially going around either side of it. This means that traffic lanes can be crossed separately and conflict points can be minimized. To that end, the pedestrian crossings mirror the crossing points for cyclists. I've also added a midpoint diagonal crossing for pedestrians because, frankly, it's a large intersection and walking around the entire thing is kind of annoying. After adding all that, there's still a ton of space left over, so I just made green space, because honestly, trees are nice, and it turns out a lot easier to draw than apartment buildings. Continuing south, the design remains pretty uneventful until we reach this somewhat infamous intersection. This is the Windsor-Chebucto-Cunard intersection, also known as the Quantum intersection. The misalignment between Chebucto and Cunard tends to make drivers moving through the intersection pretty hard to predict, as even the simple act of going straight through the intersection involves making an exaggerated turn movement. Turn signals become irregular, and drivers are prone to inventing lanes and more or less just doing whatever they can to get through the space unharmed. As a result, the intersection is often chaotic and completely congested with cars, even under relatively low traffic conditions. The bike lanes cut out before the intersection to, you guessed it, make space for turn lanes for cars, so anyone moving through the intersection on bike or on foot is dealing with a pretty hectic space. In short, no one likes this intersection, regardless of how they're moving through it. It's been an issue going all the way back to the 19th century, so it's not surprising that people have come up with a lot of different ideas for how to fix it. This is a design from one of the city's planners that was presented at the National Association of City Transportation Officials in 2019. The basic idea is to simplify the intersection by removing left turns onto Chebucto. This is done by adding a traffic island in front of the entrance to Chebucto, which prevents entry from any direction other than right turns off of Windsor. The left turn movement onto Cunard is now facilitated by a short left turn lane in the middle of the intersection. Because this lane handles turns onto Cunard and because there are no longer left turns onto Chebucto in this design, the bike lanes no longer have to drop off before the intersection. This design does seem to slightly widen the intersection to accommodate the extra turn lanes as well as the bike lanes coexisting, which looks like it might impact at least one of the trees on the northern side of the intersection. This is a straightforward, relatively low-cost way of addressing the issue, although it does come with some downsides. The most obvious is the loss of access to Chebucto in the outbound direction from this intersection. This would impact drivers, but also cyclists and some transit lines that run through the intersection. The same presentation showed off rough sketches of alternate designs for the same intersection, including various kinds of street realignments and different styles of roundabouts. Just as an example, I'm going to show off another kind of peanut roundabout. To make it fit, the lot that recently had a convenience store and a parking lot would have to be purchased and partially folded into the intersection. The convenience store has actually already been demolished, so that's fine. We don't need the entire lot, but we do need some of the parking lot to make the new layout fit. Just like with the earlier intersection, the bike and pedestrian paths wrap around the intersection, crossing at the entry and exit points for motor vehicle traffic. I've made the turn angles quite wide, so the intersection should be able to handle trucking, transit, and emergency vehicles. As always, if I've mismeasured in my sketches, there's space to modify by changing the median barrier. The leftover space where the convenience store used to be could probably still be large enough for a medium-density apartment building or a small park. I think that either of the design options can work fine. It's mostly just a question of whether we want to spend the money to maintain access to Chebucto and buy up portions of the land on the adjacent lot. There is some bad news though. No matter what we do to this intersection, the southern end of Windsor Street is basically doomed from a traffic management perspective. Here's what I mean. Traffic coming through the Windsor Street exchange and heading southbound has two main options. Take the right onto Cunard or continue straight along Windsor. Both are north-south corridors, but that's where the similarities end. In the terminology of Strong Towns, an organization that advocates for better towns and cities, Cunard is a road, whereas Windsor is a street. A road is a right-of-way that prioritizes movement between locations, and you can see this in the designs and adjacent land uses for each. Multiple lanes with relatively long distances between intersections, few if any destinations to encourage turns, restricted left turns at some intersections, and limited pedestrian attractions combine to optimize Cunard for north-south traffic. In contrast, Windsor has more closely spaced intersections, and each intersection allows a greater variety of turn movements even though there are no dedicated turn lanes. Most of the intersections have leading pedestrian signals, and even most of the intersecting local streets have marked crosswalks and pedestrian crossing beacons. There are businesses of one type or another almost everywhere along Windsor, and the increasingly dense neighborhood has a steady stream of pedestrians making their way around this part of the city. Windsor can never move a lot of cars under those conditions, but it gets even worse as we move further south. Windsor Street doesn't run parallel to Cunard or Roby, the major north-south corridors in this part of the peninsula. It runs diagonal between them. At the southernmost extent, Windsor ends at Quinpool. Because this intersection is so close to the already overcomplicated five-way Willow Tree intersection, left turns aren't permitted. This means that southbound traffic only has the option of turning right onto Quinpool and then left onto Vernon. Vernon being a bikeway, the goal is actually to have fewer cars on it. If a driver wants to exit Windsor before Quinpool, the last signalized intersection is going to be the Quantum intersection we fixed earlier. But this intersection is only 200 meters from the nearby Roby and Cunard intersection, meaning that it can only hold about 30 cars at a time. That's a lot fewer than can travel southbound along Windsor or eastbound along Chebucto, so the intersection is going to get backed up no matter how we redesign it. But drivers know this and have prepared a contingency, which mostly involves going straight through the intersection and then bombing down one of the side streets to reach Roby. These three side streets, Compton, Williams, and Welsford, have about 50 street-facing homes on them between them, but see nearly 2,000 cars per day racing down them, mostly concentrated during the morning hours. So, the southern end of Windsor outputs traffic to an intersection that will never be able to handle it, side streets where it creates safety and quality of life concerns, and a bikeway where we don't actually want a lot of car traffic. Good stuff. Fixing this kind of thing involves trade-offs. The traffic flows down Windsor more or less normally until you get past North Street. That's essentially the point of no return, after which the only place traffic can go is broadly dysfunctional. The smallest scale thing that can be done would be to close off the places where southbound traffic along Windsor is heading to unintended destinations. That would mean doing things like removing the option of exiting the 3 side streets onto Roby and even preventing Windsors from feeding onto Quinpool entirely. The function of Windsor, in theory, is to let people move around West End Halifax or from West End Halifax to connect to the citywide road network, but Windsor itself is not capable of funneling large amounts of traffic into the downtown core, just because of its basic layout, and as far as I can tell, there's not really a way to fix this. On that note, thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more videos all about getting around Halifax by bike, and to let me know in the comments how you would like to see the bike infrastructure along Windsor Street updated. That's it for this one. As always, thanks for watching, and see you next time.